We are going to continue today in the book of Judges. We are now at chapter 12. We were talking about it at the end of the service last week. We're just about through. I think there's, after today, there's 2 more Judges. And then that's it. So we got, and we're going to talk about a bunch of judges today because that's how it works sometimes. Sometimes they have a lot to say about a judge, and sometimes they don't have very much to say at all. And this is one of those. In fact, we're going to start by finishing off the story of Jephthah. So if you were with us last week, you remember that so far, Jephthah's story and Gideon's story have actually been fairly similar, except for maybe, I guess, the parentage. Gideon was a true son, and Jephthah was born not of a Israelite woman, so his family drove him away. But when there came a time of oppression, they were both raised up as commanders of the Lord's army. And interestingly enough, they both, as we're going to read this week, have an issue with Ephraim. So starting in Judges chapter 12, verse 1, it says, "The Ephraimite forces were called out, and they crossed over to Zaphon, and they said to Jephthah," so what they mean there about crossing over is they actually crossed over the Jordan. This is going to be important for later on. But they went from Ephraim in the west, out in the hill country, across to the east. Because if you remember the armies of Jephthah, although they camped out in the west, they actually pursued the armies of the Ammonites all the way across the east into the western portions of Manasseh. Eastern portions of Manasseh. And so they cross over, the Ephraimites, and they said to Jephthah, "Why did you go fight the Ammonites without calling us to go with you? We're going to burn down your house over your head. In other words, I'm going to burn it down with you in it." See what I mean? First off, Gideon and Jephthah seem to have similar conflicts, except for they've seemed to really step up the measure of their seriousness here. Right? Gideon also had a conflict with the Ephraimites, but Gideon was much more diplomatic and was able to work out a diplomatic solution with Ephraim. But Ephraim sure has a fire in their belly, don't they? Man, do they ever want to fight? They want to go out. They got an axe to grind. And so much so that he says, "We're going to burn down your house over your head." Now, do you guys remember where Gilead is? This is also going to be important later on in the story. Gilead was kind of on the eastern side of Ephraim, right near the Jordan. And so they were technically like a hodgepodge of different tribes, a bit of Ephraimites, a bit of Manassans and stuff like that. This was, of course, going to play a role later on. They weren't necessarily, because they were kind of a border town. So Jephthah answered, and this is true. If you remember how they gathered, right? If you remember at the end, I believe, of chapter 10 is when the troops gathered. They actually didn't even have a commander. They just saw an army of the Ammonites marching towards them. They gathered up an army and then went, "Okay, what do? We don't know what we're doing." And then they went out and found Jephthah, got Jephthah to lead them, and then Jephthah led them to victory. So Jephthah answered, "I and my people were engaged in a great struggle with the Ammonites, and although I called you," because remember, all of Israel was called, "you didn't save me out of their hands. And when I saw that you wouldn't help, I took my life in my hands and crossed over the Jordan, once again, to fight the Ammonites." He pursued them right in their own territory. "And the Lord gave me victory over them. Now why have you come up today to fight me?" I like this because he actually gives them a chance to save face. And I've actually talked about this. I don't know if I talked about it publicly from the pulpit or if I've talked about it just with a bunch of people, but we've talked about pride before. And pride can be a big deal, but I don't, and hear me out, I don't think pride in and of itself is necessarily a bad thing. For example, I was really proud that both Michelle and I didn't goof up on Hosanna because in practice, we kept coming in too early on this one spot, but we got it right. Yes. But I also weigh that with an ounce of humility, and I go, "Thank you, praise God. I'm so glad, Lord, that you helped me get through this." Right? But it's not the pride in and of itself that does that, but pride definitely can become a stumbling block, can it not? And here Jephthah is calling them out. He says, "Look, I did call you. I did give you an opportunity to be a part of this. I gave you an opportunity to be part of the Lord's army and come up against the enemies of those that would see us die. But you didn't come. You didn't save me out of their hands. Where were you, Ephraim? So why have you come up to make a beef against me? Now it seems that this very diplomatic way of speaking didn't really lower the tensions, because we read in the very next verse that then Jephthah called together the men of Gilead and fought against Ephraim. They end up clashing, they end up going to fight over this. And the Gileadites, now you got to remember, Ephraim is a huge area. Gilead is a town. They should be outnumbered. They should be, this should really go one way. But it seems that Jephthah's renown as a mighty warrior and as a general and a commander was certainly well deserved, because he ends up taking this smaller group of people and he strikes down the Ephraimites. Strikes them down because the Ephraimites had said, "You Gileadites are renegades from Ephraim and Manasseh. You don't even belong to us. You're going out. You're extremists going out on your own, doing your own thing. Who do you think you are? You do not represent the nation of Israel." The Gileadites then captured the fort. So remember, they've already fought them and won. But of course, they didn't. In any conflict, in any battle, you don't just fight, win, and everyone on your enemy side is dead, because very few people actually want to stand there and fight to the death. You see that you're losing, you go, "Well, I'm getting out of here," and you run. And that's exactly what happened here. And so the Gileadites went forward and they secured the fords of the Jordan leading to Ephraim. So they went up to the river and they secured all the crossing places and said, "Aha, now we got them." And whenever a survivor of Ephraim said, "Let me cross over," the men of Gilead asked him, "Are you an Ephraimite?" And if he replied no, they said, "All right, say Shibboleth." Okay. Now, Morris, I want you to say, "The hot ham herbs on my hot dog taste good." You know what I'm getting at. Can you say hot herbs? For those who don't know, he's from Newfoundland. And you don't say your H's. And that's exactly what's going on here, okay? That's exactly what's happening here. This is a regional dialect that these people are picking up on, and they know that they cannot say shibboleth, that instead, as you read in that same verse, it says if he said sibboleth, because they didn't say the sh sound, they said s. And this actually goes back to what it looks like. It's funny, if you... It's a weird thing to look at in the Hebrew, because they actually have to phoneticize it, because otherwise it doesn't make sense, because the top one is just a word, a normal word, and then they actually have to make it out like, yeah, it sounds different because they're saying it wrong or differently. But you can see that as you travel all across Canada, right? No matter where you go, there's all kinds of different dialects, different emphasis, different enunciations. We talk differently, and so that helps us to understand where someone's from. Right, we can tell where someone lives based on the way that they speak, because they speak like the group that they are around. And so they knew that the Ephraimites had this certain little thing. And because they could not pronounce the word correctly, they seized him, the Ephraimites that would cross, and they killed him at the fords of the Jordan. And 42,000 Ephraimites were killed at that time. Now, this is one of those things, and it has to go back to what we were talking about last week, about the scholarly debates and stuff like that, because we're still not reading, and then the Lord instructed him to go and do this, but we do read that Jephthah was a hero of the faith. We do read that Jephthah was acting on behalf of the Lord. And so I have to believe here that sometimes we don't understand it. And we were actually talking about this morning before church. We were having a conversation about sometimes we don't understand the leadership and what people are doing. We don't understand what the decisions that certain people make. We disagree with it, even vehemently. But we have to trust that the Lord is going to have his way, and that God sometimes raises up men like Pharaoh in order to make a point. God raises up men like Belshazzar to make a point, right? To bring judgment. And so what's going on here? I don't really, like, this one always hits me hard, because I'm like, man, Jephthah, why did you have such an axe to grind against your own people? But I have to believe that God was using him in order to maybe show judgment on Ephraim for their pride, right? Because all of this happened because of their pride. If Ephraim hadn't have been so proud and boastful in their own accomplishments, so they wouldn't have thought so highly of themselves, none of this would have happened. They could have saved face and said, you know what, you're right, Jephthah. We were called and we didn't show up. We should have. But they didn't. Instead, it led to this conflict. And then it says that after that, Jephthah led Israel for 6 years. And then Jephthah the Gileadite died and was buried in the town of Gilead. Which, by the way, I think is actually a good end of the story, because if you remember at the very beginning, back in chapter 11, Jephthah was driven out of his hometown. He wasn't allowed to be with his family. He had been driven away because he was the son of a prostitute. He wasn't a true son. He had been cast away. And yet God has a way of using these types of people, doesn't he? Of finding those that we would discard, and yet he raises them up to do mighty things. And that's exactly the life that Jephthah led. And I still have a lot of questions, and maybe one day I'll get to sit down with Jephthah, and we'll sit there and we'll have a conversation with Jephthah. What happened here? Because we're not given a lot of details. And I would love to know the rest of the story. What happened here, Jephthah? But it does seem that according to Scripture, he was a hero of faith, and that he was a man of God. So I'm gonna trust the Lord in that. And then it follows on, and this is what I mean. And then we're gonna get 3 in a row. After him was Ibzan of Bethlehem. Now this is not the Bethlehem. Okay, this is another Bethlehem. Now I don't know if you know, but at one point there was 3 Cold Springs, Ontario. There was one down by Cobourg, one outside of Peterborough, and there was another one up north. Okay? People are very unimaginative, and we like to name things the same things over and over again. So yes, I know this name really sticks out, but it's not the one that we're thinking of. But anyway, Ibzan of Bethlehem, he led Israel, and he had, and we're going to notice there's something familiar happening here, he had 30 sons and 30 daughters, and he gave his daughters away in marriage to those outside of his clan. And for his sons, he brought in 30 young women as wives from outside of his clan. And Ibzan led Israel for 7 years, and then Ibzan died and was buried in Bethlehem. What's interesting about him, one of the disputes that comes out here is that they say, well, is this really a good person? What's going on? Well, it seems that he led Israel, number one. So he's obviously noteworthy. Samuel found him noteworthy, something to be remembered. And as I've said before, oftentimes when we talk about he led Israel, they don't talk about the tyrant ones that led Israel down a horrible path. We don't get to that until we get to the kings. What we do see here is that these tend to be men that are leading Israel toward the path of God, back onto the path of righteousness. Because as we remember, the gods like the Baals and the Asherahs and the Molochs were constantly coming back into the faith. And we're going to read about a new one next week. They were constantly taking on the gods of the cultures around them. They were allowing the culture to pour in and mingle with their own and change their beliefs. And so I believe when I read this, that this was a man who was trying to bring Israel back on track and say, no, we have to do this. Now, why do I say all this? Because they talk about a way in marriage outside the clan. And so this actually ends up a dispute, and maybe one day you'll have an argument with someone about this. But people say, aha, see, this was outside of the nation of Israel. No, it was outside of its clan. For all we know, it's literally just to the other tribes, right? Maybe to Ephraimites, because it turns out they have a major people shortage after what just happened. And we're going to read about that too with Benjamin later on. They had the same issue and actually had to have a call out from the other tribes to bring in daughters to bear them children. And also he brought in for his sons 30 young women as wives from outside of the clan. Again, this is probably other Israelite women, because I feel like otherwise it would have said outside of the people of Israel. Then after him, Elon, the Zebulunite, led Israel for 10 years. And he was so noteworthy that then we go straight to his death. And he was buried in Ajalon in the land of Zebulun. And then after him, Abdon, the son of Hillel, from Pirathon, led Israel. And he had 40 sons and 30 grandsons, who rode on 70 donkeys, and he led Israel 8 years. Then Abdon, son of Hillel, died and was buried at Pirathon in Ephraim in the hill country of who? The Amalekites. This is obviously going to become a bigger deal as we move on to later chapters. And that is actually all of chapter 12. And I love that end of that last part because we often skip over it. We don't think much because what's a donkey? Not like what's a donkey. We know what a donkey is, but like who cares that they had donkeys? Except for in that time, in that culture, right? Because we often think, if when we see it in movies and stuff like that in olden days, you watch a king come in mounted on like the most regal-looking horse they can find, right? But as we've been covering time and time again, if you've never been to Israel like me, but as we've been covering, the area that we're talking about is mountains and hills and not exactly great grazing country for large beasts like horses. And so instead, one of the beasts of burden, one of the most prized possessions that you could have was something much more durable, much more sturdy, and that was a donkey. And in fact, kings rode donkeys in those days because a donkey was a good animal. It was something you wanted to have. Which is weird because I know what donkeys are like now, and they're mean and rude. They're not like horses at all. But it's also why it was such a big deal when Jesus rode a donkey down into the town, right? It was the king procession being brought into the city, right? And we can see that. And also it also shows a level of power and influence and wealth that this man had. That this wasn't no slouch. This was someone really important who led the nation and did amazing things because he had 70 donkeys. And if you remember earlier on, it was a big deal that Buddy had 30 donkeys. Well, it seems like they're getting richer and richer as time goes on. But one of the big things that I take away from this, as before we move on to a time of prayer, one of the biggest things that I see over and over again, and it became especially apparent here in chapter 12, is this problem once again with pride. That pride keeps getting in the way of otherwise good decisions, right? Jephthah goes, he conquers the army against the enemy. The oppression is over. The people are free. They can get back to worshiping the Lord. But then pride gets in their way, and it ends up leading to a second conflict that never needed to happen. Right? And this is one of those things that I was saying earlier. Right? It's hard for me to say that pride in and of itself is wrong, but pride is definitely something that can lead to something wrong. It's as I had a professor once who put it like this. He said, it's like music is amoral. Music doesn't mean one thing or another, but music can cause us to feel a certain way or think certain things or cause us to experience a certain thing that'll therefore drive us forward to do something. Right? The music in and of itself is amoral. It doesn't have a message. I'm talking about music, not lyrics. Whereas the messages we attach, the feelings that we get, those are the things that push us forward. And I think that's what we see here with pride. See, pride, there was lots of opportunity to be proud here, to be boastful. But as Jesus said, you boast in the wrong things. You don't boast in the Lord. And as a result, 42,000 Ephraimites were killed at that time. And I know this one is kind of a transition period, and it really is, because next week we're going to move into what's going to become one of the biggest adversaries that we're going to continue to read about, and actually is still someone to this day who remains in the land of Israel. We've heard of, we call them the Philistines, which is where they're the sea people, the Philistia. That's why they worship fish things. And it's also where we get the name Palestine, if you didn't know. But we're coming near the end of the time of the judges, and you can see why. You're also seeing that their reigns get shorter and shorter, right? Jephthah led for 6, Ibzan led for 7, Elon led for 10, and Abon led for 8. The reigns are getting shorter, which generally is a sign of things beginning to break down. Things aren't working the way that God had set them up, and we're about to see a major shift happen in chapter 13. So with that, I want to leave that. I want to open it up and ask you guys if you have anything to pray for, if you have anything that's on your heart, if you have anything that needs attention, or if you have any praise reports that you want to give praise to the Lord. This is an interesting chapter. It certainly makes me reflective and much more grateful for grace. And it was something that was definitely on our mind, and that's why we wanted to really focus on grace in this particular worship set, is that, we do need to really appreciate the grace that the Lord shows us and understand that it does reveal the bad that we do, but also shows us the forgiveness that God gives. And so as we offer up our prayer requests and stuff like that, please keep that in mind, and maybe there is something that's on your heart.